we will be sending out the slide deck, a PDF form of the slide deck, as well as the recording of the session after a couple of days after we conclude this Human Trafficking 101. And if there are any follow-up questions that I'm not able to answer while we're in session, I'll send the answers that I was able to gather. So with that, I hope everybody filled out the pre-survey. If not, I know I've been talking a lot about it, but we do want to make sure our program is good, and we need your feedback for that. So I put that survey link back into the chat box. So let's get started. So welcome to Human Trafficking 101. I know you may have seen some of the slides beforehand as we were waiting for the session to start, but let me give you a recap of what human trafficking, NC Stop Human Trafficking does. We've got a vision of a state free of human trafficking with a mission of creating communities actively working to abolish human trafficking. We are a non-religious, non-political nonprofit. And we do that with 4 action items. The first would be what we're here today for, which is education. So we equip community members, service providers, and professionals to identify human trafficking and make appropriate referrals and respond appropriately depending on the situation. For instance, for law enforcement professionals, we would encourage them to interact with in a safe way to make sure that the victim is safe, and interact with the possible victim. However, for community members, we're going to tell you to call the National Human Trafficking Hotline, because we want you to stay safe, and we also want the victims to stay safe as well. So we also collaborate. That's a big part of what we do here. So human trafficking is a multifaceted issue, and that's why collaboration is a must in the fight, right? We can't address human trafficking as professionals working in a silo. So bringing everybody together can really contribute to stronger victim response and stronger continuum of care for survivors. And legislation. So change begins with sound policy decisions. So we advocate for stronger anti-human trafficking legislation on state and federal levels. And then the fair trading piece. So we are a nonprofit. We're small but mighty. We do a lot of things across the state. But at the same time, we still need to raise money to do those programs. And a part of our fundraising efforts is Fair Traders Project. And I'll talk to you a little more about that later. But it's also a way where we can combat human trafficking on a global scale, really. Fair trade products are products made without child labor, without slave labor, and for fair wages. The more people or the more consumers that demand ethically made products or ethically harvested products, the less likely there's going to be labor trafficking and labor exploitation. So with that piece, we sell fair trade products ourselves as a nonprofit, but we encourage consumers to also buy ethically sourced and ethically created products and produce. So the questions for today, what are we talking about? It's going to be pretty simple. It's pretty standard. The first was, we're going to go over what human trafficking actually is. What's the reality of human trafficking in North Carolina and in the United States? And hopefully, if I do my job well enough, we're going to be debunking a lot of myths that some may have. What does human trafficking look like? Again, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the reality of human trafficking in North Carolina and the United States. And we're going to, again, be debunking those myths and really talking about the core of what this crime and this type of abuse really is, and what we can do about it as community members. This is not a professional training. So this training is geared towards community members and how we as a community can combat human trafficking, and also how we can report our suspicions. So with that, human trafficking is a big business globally. And when I say big business, it's all about money. It's an illegal business, it's an illicit business, it's an illegitimate business, but it is a business nonetheless, right? If there were not demand for commercial sex and cheap labor, then we wouldn't have human trafficking, okay? So the International Labor Organization estimated that human trafficking or traffickers made around $150 billion annually. And this is just an estimate. There is no way we can have a solid number about this around human trafficking, because it is an illicit business and because it does operate underground and in the shadows, for the most part, in the shadows, but also right in our faces as well. But I'll unpack that a little bit later. So after drug dealing, human trafficking is tied with illegal arms trade as the second largest criminal industry in the world, and it's the fastest growing criminal industry in the world. And this is from a study by the International Labor Organization. They did just come out with a new one, but this is the old information. We haven't had a chance to unpack that new report yet. So the same report said 40 million people around the world are victims of human trafficking. And women and children are disproportionately affected by human trafficking. And again, we can't possibly know the actual number. These are just estimates. 1 in 4 victims of human trafficking are children, according to the same study. And we're talking a global snapshot right now. And as I talk about a global snapshot, I'm going to continue to retract, and we'll do a hyper focus on North Carolina and the United States. I just want you to see what it looks like globally first. 71% of victims are women and girls. Is from the same study, or the same report, excuse me. So with that, what is human trafficking? And if anybody wants to put in the chat box what they think human trafficking is, I totally encourage you to do that. I'll give y'all a second to put in your responses. When you put in your responses, it'll help me know where the group as a whole is around their knowledge base. Okay. All right. Thank you for those responses. Perfect. All right. We have a lot of responses that say for financial gain, and that is very important to understand, because that is one of the cornerstones of human trafficking. So with that, let's give you the definition. And this is the definition according to the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. The TVPRA, or the TVPA, however you want to call it, Trafficking Victims Protection Act, was authorized in 2000. It's a federal statute. And the federal statute outlines exactly what human trafficking is for the United States, but it also sets the standard for what human trafficking is globally. So the definition is right here, and I'm going to send you the slide deck. I'm not going to read this definition to you, but I will explain to you that human trafficking is compelling somebody to work or perform a commercial sex act using force, fraud, or coercion. Now, when we're talking about commercial sex acts, that definition is is a little different when we're talking about people under the age of 18. Okay, that's when we're going to be going into child sex trafficking, and I'll unpack that a little bit later. But this is the general definition of what human trafficking is according to the U.S. And I can talk all day long about human trafficking, how it happens, what situations can look like, and personally, I believe that a survivor should probably tell you. So this is a survivor. She's, well, she's not from North Carolina. She's actually from the Netherlands, and she was recruited here by a trafficker online as an adult. And she's going to tell you a little bit about how it started. If you'll give me a moment, I've got to share my sound. So hold on one sec.
Let's go back to when you met. You said you met online. Go ahead again. And how did he convince you to come to the U.S. to see it?
Honestly, I wouldn't be able to pinpoint how he managed to do that. It was just like we were in a relationship. I didn't see no danger.
So we were talking about when you first came, and so there were no red flags. Everything was totally fine. Then you came back the second time with your kids. When you came back with them, it was just for a vacation.
Yes. Yes.
So tell us, how did you end up staying?
I got an email from my ex-husband stating that the house that I was staying in was being confiscated by the police because I had animals. And the girl that was supposed to be taking care of my animals wasn't doing it. Well, I was gone for 3 weeks, and animals do what they have to do, so it was, needless to say, pretty nasty. And I lost everything, and this is where our abuser started whispering in my ear, stay here, I'll marry you, don't worry about it, I'll take care of you, your kids, and we're going to be a family. And so, with that in the back of my mind, I talked to my ex-husband, and we agreed that I should just go ahead and stay. I believed that he was going to marry me. I believed that everything was going to be fine, everything was going to be normal. Little did I know that 3 months later, 2 months later, things were going to be different. That we were going to be victims of his tyranny. In the beginning, he would pretend that when he kicked me out of the bed, calling me a dog, he pretended the next day that he didn't remember. But he remembered because I had to get with the program. So that's what he used, and when he figured out that he couldn't get me personally is when he started getting my kids, because he realized that the only way he could hurt me was hurting my kids. So that's how he got us to stay.
So you were here on a tourist visa?
Yes.
And he just encouraged you to...
Yes.
He didn't offer to get you an attorney so you could stay here legally?
No, it was all about him. He wanted to get an attorney because he was still married at the time. He wanted to get an attorney for that. He did call immigration lawyers, but he said that it was too expensive. So he just told me to lay low, not get in trouble.
Okay. This session's about an hour and a half, and if there is not a particularly triggering, and I got a question, and it was a wonderful question. This one didn't typically have, I didn't think that it had any triggers in it, and honestly, I could have been wrong about that. If there were, I do apologize. There is another video that is coming up that has a lot of potential triggers, and I do often warn about that. If somebody was triggered by this, my apologies. So let's talk a little bit about force. And please, when we have the post survey, if anything that I do that needs to be improved on, I do want to encourage you to make a comment about that so I can do better. So let's talk a little bit about force. A lot of people think that force is when the free candy van coming into the neighborhood taking children, or the common misconceptions around the holiday season where there's somebody trying to traffic people out of retail parking lots and things like that. I'm not saying that kidnap doesn't happen, but it happens far less in human trafficking cases than people believe, and I hope that makes sense. There's a lot of misconception around how human trafficking really begins in most situations. And in most situations, it begins with coercion. or it begins with fraud and then goes into coercion. And then it's force piece, because there is force in human trafficking. And the force piece is when that person tries to leave or they don't want to do this. And that's when it becomes, that's when force is typically involved. But again, all human trafficking situations aren't the same. And it's important to know that. So what force looks like in human trafficking typically, and I'm only speaking to typically, again, I'm talking about common threats. So we've got physical abuse, sexual abuse, and confinement. And now, again, this is a survivor, and she's going to talk a little bit about force. And this does have a potential trigger because she will be speaking about physical abuse. If any of these videos become too much, please mute or leave the room and come back. It's okay. Let me share my sound.
Yes, my daughter, my son and daughter, they witnessed our abuser choking me to where I couldn't breathe, and it really scared my daughter. She went to school the next day, and she went to a counselor, and she told him what was going on in the house, and I wasn't aware that she did that. Next thing I know, police are knocking on the door. They're separating me and my abuser, and they were actually pushing me to admit to what was going on, but I couldn't do it because our abuser kept telling me that he knew how to kill somebody, he knew how to get rid of a body, that nobody would find us, that law enforcement and the government was not going to help us, that they were going to take my kids away from me, they would put me in jail, I would never see my kids again. When you hear that for a couple of years on top of all the abuse, you believe it. So once the police actually came in there and aggressively wanted me to tell them what was going on, I denied everything because it was the authority, and I was trained to believe that the authorities were bad. So that's what happened. And then we went just right back into the same routine. My daughter came home that afternoon and he severely beat her.
So let's talk a little bit about fraud and how this happened. And in the survivor's case, it was fraud that got her to the US and to the trafficker. He made her believe that they were, and in so many in this case they were, but they were that abuse was hinged on exploiting his partner, right? So that's what we talk about when we're talking about fraud. They're selling that dream, like the romantic dream, or grooming the victim to believe that the perpetrator is a friend, a lover, a protector, somebody that's going to take care of them, or selling that dream of prosperity. Come over here, which that's not the case for this survivor, but selling the dream of prosperity, which is enticing a victim to work using a form of persuasion that would make the victim believe they would become financially better off. This happens a lot in labor trafficking, but also in sex trafficking. Come over here, you'll make a lot of money, you'll be a model. And what happens is it turns into sex trafficking through pornography or just prostitution, or being prostituted, excuse me. So coercion, what's that look like? Coercion is this is how the coercive piece is really how traffickers like maintain their control. And there's a lot of highly coercive tactics that traffickers use where force isn't necessary. It doesn't even have to be involved. So when we talk about coercion in human trafficking, we're talking about seizure of documentation. Now, that does include seizure of documents by foreign-born nationals, of course, but traffickers also take the identification of people who are U.S. citizens born right here. Imagine all the things you can't do without a license, without your birth certificate, without a social security card. That takes out legitimate work and housing, right? So it's really important to kind of see how coercive traffickers can be to keep people under their control. Psychological threats, so that's threats of harm to the victim or the victim's loved ones. The survivor in this video really kind of outlined what was the cornerstone of that coercion for her was her children, right? Debt bondage. So debt bondage includes, I'm not sure if you all know what debt bondage is. If you do, please just ignore me. But if you don't, debt bondage is, for instance, a person who is coming to the U.S. to work, right? So they pay the trafficker or the labor contractor, depending on how you want to look at it. They pay them transportation fees, recruitment fees. So they're already in a debt situation. They get here and they start working, and then they have to pay for their housing that the trafficker supplies, the food that the trafficker inflates. And the person who decides when that debt is paid off is the trafficker. So when we say debt bondage, we mean they have absolutely no way to pay the debt off. And traffickers make sure that they don't. Incomplete manipulation. And in many cases, human trafficking is intimate partner violence for something of value. In the survivor story that we've listened to thus far, that is intimate partner violence for something of value. So what does human trafficking look like in North Carolina? Obviously, we have a problem. But the new numbers did come out in 2021. In 2020, North Carolina ranked number 9, but in 2021, we ranked number 13. That's which amounts to 223 human trafficking cases confirmed by the National Human Trafficking Hotline and 340 victims involved in those cases, right? And this is all according to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So that just means calls to the 1-888-373-7888 number. This does not include domestic violence centers sheltering victims. This doesn't include sexual assault crisis centers serving victims. This doesn't include healthcare providers assisting victims who are injured or have been abused. This doesn't include child advocacy centers serving victims, and it doesn't include local, state, and federal law enforcement investigations. And it also doesn't include all the victims that have not self-identified. Right. So I'm telling you, this is the only number that we have. And that's why you have it in this presentation. But is it accurate? Probably not. Probably not. I would argue it's much higher. And if you have any questions about that, why I would say that, please, you can ask those questions. By all means, I'm open to having a conversation today, too. But I will tell you, this is the only number that we have. We don't have a very good system to collect this data. So every number I give you, it's just what we have right now. This happened in Pitt County. This is an example of child sex trafficking. And is also an example of an intimate partner violence situation, an intimate partner situation, right? Where the trafficker is also presented as an intimate partner. So he recruited the trafficker was arrested on multiple human trafficking charges after a 16-year-old girl died of an apparent overdose in the Baymont Inn and Suites in Greenville. So he recruited that child to a romantic relationship and made her sell sex to pay for the hotel room and provide them both with money. And he was charged with felony human trafficking of a child victim, felony sexual servitude of a child victim, felony promoting prostitution for profit, and felony statutory rape of a child 15 or younger, and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. She had just turned 16 at the time of her passing. And we don't talk a lot about vulnerabilities in this presentation, but I can say there are certain populations that are more vulnerable to being trafficked, okay? And those populations include people who are living in poverty, people who have a history of child abuse, specifically child sexual abuse, but a history of child abuse either way, histories with child protective services, being involved as a child in, the system, if you would, and people who have a substance use disorder, people who are become homeless. And the list really does go on and on, because the people that I'm talking about often don't have a strong support network. And it's when those people who don't have a strong support network fall through the cracks is when traffickers come to exploit those vulnerabilities. And I hope that makes sense, because when I talk about vulnerable populations, I'm not saying these people are more susceptible to who are more susceptible to, lies or anything like that. I'm saying that a lot of times their living situations are dire, and the choices that are presented are the only choices that are available are not good. I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box or the Q&A. This happened in Durham County. This is a Durham County massage parlor case. In North Carolina, we've got a problem with illicit massage businesses. I don't know if anybody's heard about that in the room, but it is an issue. And when I mentioned debt bondage is like a kind of a hallmark of illicit massage businesses, trafficking schemes, right? But this is an example of how human trafficking is oftentimes a low-cost crime for the trafficker, right? One of the traffickers here pleaded guilty to 3 counts of promoting prostitution and only received 3 years of probation. And it's because trafficking survivors do not want to testify against their traffickers. And that makes a lot of sense when you think about what they've gone through. And when you think about the nature of the abuse, many don't want to testify, and who could really blame them, right? But that is why it is a low-cost crime. It's rare that traffickers actually are arrested, and if they are, it's rare that there is a federal conviction for trafficking or sentencing either. So this happened in Pitt County. Again, this is a case where the internet was used for running the exploitation ring. And the mindset of the perpetrator really kind of outlines how some traffickers see people. They see them more as commodities and not as human beings, right? So he allegedly supplied the victims with a place to live and hygiene products and made them have sex with him first so that he can grade them and advertise them properly, right? So he was more concerned about advertising them properly online than he was about the fact that he's exploiting these people who obviously were not in a good place. This happened in Durham County. This is actually a case where the district attorney and the investigative team did not need a victim testimony. And this is like really a landmark case because they were able to get a conviction for 31 years of this trafficker. And he was on the phone, in the jail phone, talking about how he had beat these charges in 2 other states and he really wasn't worried about North Carolina. But the district attorney and the investigative team, though they did not have victim testimony, they were able to get this conviction. So it's totally possible to do this without re-traumatization of victims. Just so we're all on the same page. We don't, the last thing we want to see is a survivor re-traumatized. And we could really unpack justice and things too, but this is a 101. This has happened in Cumberland County. This is an example of labor trafficking, where children were forced to work in a fish market in the Fayetteville area by a minister and a church congregation members. The children were allegedly physically abused when they objected. How this kind of happened, how this bust happened really, was a 16-year-old ran away and actually went to law enforcement for help. And that is how this investigation began. So the community at large didn't report or even acknowledge that there were children working in 2 fish markets and a catering company at all hours of the day, not in school, and not even reporting these kind of dangerous situations. So that's why I'm glad you're here. This happened in Pender County. This is just an example. Another case where a trusted person was attempting to exploit. This happened in Craven County. These are all sex buyers and traffickers. And it amounted to 10 perpetrators. One of the suspects is a woman. She's a trafficker, or an alleged trafficker, excuse me. And another is a Pamlico County commissioner. So when we say trusted people. Perpetrators, whether they are buyers or traffickers, can also be people who have power in the community. It's then that's just the nature of how human trafficking looks. This happened in Sampson County. This again happened in Pitt County. I'm going to send you the slide decks, but I want to make sure I respect your time. So this case involves another illegal activity. A 16-year-old girl had tried to use a counterfeit $20 bill at the Dollar General in Greenville, and it was actually a counterfeit investigation began, but that investigation turned out where law enforcement officers discovered the 16-year-old girl in a Greenville hotel, and they discovered that she was being trafficked, but she wasn't run away from New York. So my point is, human trafficking doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? It's not just the only crime happening is human trafficking. No, not at all, right? Typically, there are other crimes connected to it. And we could talk about substance use disorders because the intersection, especially in the eastern part of the state, is huge. We're talking about substance use disorders and human trafficking. But that'll probably be in Human Trafficking 201, which I hope you'll be at January 10th. So why does human trafficking occur in North Carolina? If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. I did just see one in the chat box, so give me one moment. There are agencies working across the state to make data collection easier. And there is also a federal program where it's supposed to make data collection much easier as well. But again, that takes a lot of time. And you'd also have to have law enforcement buy-in around that data collection, right? Okay. So all of the cases, there was another question about when these cases occurred. The most recent, the one in Pitt County, the 2021 at the Bay Mine Inn, and then that one happened in 2014. This one happened in 2016. This one happened in 2017. This one happened in 2017. This one happened in 2018. And this one happened in 2019. And that one happened in 2016. I think that was it, 2019. I hope that answered your question. Again, it's all in the slide decks that I'll be sending out. So why does human trafficking occur in North Carolina? Well, we got I-85 and I-95, right? Those are big transportation highways. And that means there's going to be a lot of truck stops along those highways in North Carolina where sex trafficking occurs, right? But also, you do not have to move people for them to be trafficked, right? You can be trafficked right out of your own home. But some traffickers operate to where they will take victims to various conventions, sporting events, and other bigger cities along highways. And that's because they're following the demand, right? I did mention earlier in the presentation that human trafficking is all about making money off the exploitation of other people, and traffickers follow the demand for sex where it's necessary, but they also follow the demand for labor when we're talking about migrant farm workers and things like that. So we have a lot of military bases in the state too. Again, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about demand. I'm not saying anything bad about military bases. I'm saying though, that there's a high concentration of men at these military bases, and where there's a high concentration of men, there's usually going to be a higher concentration or a higher demand, for commercial sex. And traffickers follow the demand again, right? It's a coastal state, so again, tourism's up, but that also means demand's up, okay? For sex and labor. And we have a high immigrant population and a large agricultural industry. Now that typically goes hand in hand. Domestic born people are trafficked, just like people who are born in different countries are trafficked, or born in other countries are trafficked, right? But with the high immigrant population and large agricultural industry, that's the demand for cheap labor, okay? As a matter of fact, North Carolina, typically, when we're talking about labor trafficking, the number one industry in North Carolina is typically agriculture, except for in 2021, which appears to have been an anomaly because it's now the number one industry for labor trafficking is domestic work, and then number two is agriculture. I've been working here for 5 years almost, and that's the first time I've seen agriculture bump from number one. So let's take a look at labor trafficking, right? Because there are a lot of people talk about sex trafficking, but we rarely talk about labor trafficking. We really should, because it is just as prevalent as sex trafficking. So that's using force, fraud, or coercion to make somebody work, right? And we're talking about nannies and maids, so that's domestic work, factories, janitorial jobs, construction sites, farm work, restaurants, hotels, and nail salons. This happened in Greene County. This is a case where this is a case where agricultural workers who were here legally under the H-2A guest worker visa program were trafficked. And I know you might be wondering, well, why in the world is this a civil case? That's a very good question. In labor trafficking cases, it is super hard to investigate because it's on the victim to come forward and say, please help me. I'm being trafficked for labor. Who has the language for that, right? It just, for some, it may seem like a terrible choice that they made and now they're stuck, right? They may not know that there is assistance. And in this case, criminal investigation wasn't able to be like nailed down, but a civil, sometimes justice is in the form of a civil settlement. Okay. So they were charged, and this is how we know it's human trafficking, right? They were charged unlawful recruitment fees. Under the H-2A guest worker visa program, you're not supposed to be charged a recruitment fee. That's actually illegal. The workers didn't get what they were promised, and they were subjected to threats and coercive manipulation to keep working. So there's coercion right there, and fraud with a recruitment fee, and their passports were confiscated. So their documentation was seized. Look at those. Look at the threads there. This happened in Mecklenburg County. The trafficker was actually a family member. She physically and mentally abused the victim, or the survivor, excuse me, falsely claimed the victim owed her $180,000. So the survivor was in a debt bondage situation. The survivor worked 10 hours a day for 6 to 7 days a week and treated the survivor in a humiliating and demeaning way. That's another example, and this is actually a criminal case. So, does anybody have any questions about labor trafficking? I began my advocacy actually in labor trafficking. I was a journalist for about 7 years before I started this work. And while I was a journalist, I was doing an investigative piece. Well, I would call it an enterprise piece when I first started, about farm workers in Eastern North Carolina. And I discovered that those men were being trafficked. Oh, I didn't have the language for it either. I actually took a human trafficking 101 from this organization to discover that what I was seeing was human trafficking, labor trafficking. But anyway, long story short, don't want to go down a rabbit hole about me. That's actually where I learned about human trafficking, was through those farm worker stories. And then I just shifted gears and started here. It's been great. Now this video is good. This video is heavy, and it has a lot of potential triggers in it. It's about common threads of how recruitment of sex trafficking begins in youth. So there is mention of abuse, sexual assault, and child sexual abuse. Okay. If you don't want to view this video, it's about 5 minutes long, so you can take a 5-minute break and come on back. Okay.
You know, you're 12 years old and you're living with your moms, and your mom's is struggling because she didn't think that life was really going to work out like this for her, and she doesn't have a man around, and the men that are around haven't always been that great. sexual abuse is becoming kind of normal for you, and you think that other people don't have secrets that are as bad as you, and maybe you've tried to talk to somebody at school and they haven't really heard you, or maybe they just haven't had time to listen to you. And so you're seeing these girls on the videos, and they're so pretty and they're so sexy, and so your way at 12 of escaping into this fantasy world is to think about what it must be like to be one of these girls, and you know that adult men already look at you, and you wonder how you can kind of use that.
I was just a child, and that's how I was supposed to live, like a child and like an adult.
So one day you're coming out of school and there's a guy outside in a Cadillac, and he's nice looking. I mean, he's got the baseball cap and the jeans and the Timbs, and he tells you how pretty you are, and you know how pretty your hair looks, and it's been a while since anybody even really noticed anything about you. And for the first time, you feel like somebody's really interested in you, because now all of a sudden he's asking you about your dreams and your hopes and where your father's at, and he says that he can be a daddy to you.
The people that I shouldn't have depended on, I was depending on for support.
And so that night he takes you to a club and he puts you up on the stage and he gives you a few drinks, and there's men throwing dollars at you, and it's scary, but all the time you're just looking at his face in the back of the room, and he's like, you know, go ahead, baby girl, go ahead, you're doing it for daddy. And you're feeling proud because nobody's ever said that to you. And so then that night he tells you that there's more stuff that you've got to do, and he takes you into a room and there's a man there, and he tells you to strip, and you think this is something you'll never do, and yet there's a part of you that already knew how to do this, because that's what your stepfather's been doing to you all these years before. And so you turn that trick, and it's like a part of you has died inside. And so you come out of the club that night, and you get in the car, and you know he's pumping 50 Cent, and he takes you to McDonald's, and he tells you, you did a good job tonight, sweetie. And he's stuffing his pockets with the $1,000 that he made. And right now, you're happy.
The people that I shouldn't have depended on, I was depending on for support.
You feel like this is the best that it's ever going to get, and everything else in your life has prepared you for this moment, or the sexual abuse, or the neglect, or the drama, or the pain, or the trauma has prepared you for tonight, where you stepped across a line that you always thought you'd never really quite step across. And you don't realize that night what it will be like to be on the track and get raped. And you don't realize that daddy isn't really going to protect you. You don't realize what it's like to have a gun held to your head that night. You don't realize what it's going to be like when you catch your first STD. You don't realize what it's going to be like when you first come home and daddy beats you for the first time because you didn't make enough money. You don't know what it's going to be like to have cops offer to trade sex with you in exchange for not being arrested. And then sometimes you'll do that and they'll still lock you up anyway. You don't know what it's like to sit up in jail and know that you just made $1,500 for your pimp last night, but he won't come down and put $200 bail on just to get you out a few days early. You don't know what it's like to walk down the street at 6 o'clock in the morning when you're just getting off work and people are starting their day and they see you and they know what you do and they look at you in a way that you just don't feel like you belong in that world anymore. And you don't know what it's like to feel like you've lost part of yourself along the way and to feel like you'll never leave. And no matter how many times you try to leave, he'll always find you and catch you. But that night, all you care about is the fact you're riding in a Cadillac and you're eating McDonald's and you're listening to 50 and you got this one man who you really think loves you sitting right by your side.
Okay. All right, so that was kind of an introduction into sex trafficking. Again, not every human sex trafficking experience is the same. I want to be very clear about that. But we do talk a lot about common threads, okay? And the number in that video, the 300,000, that's a very old video, and I don't know if that number is accurate, to be fully transparent. But I will say that it's around 75%, 75 to 90% of victims of sex trafficking do report being sexually abused as children. Now, again, that number is always going to depend on the study and the nature of the questioning and things around that. Okay, I just want to be clear, when we give you numbers like this, we just don't know. Like, we just can give you the information that we do have, and I want to be very clear about that. But sex trafficking, right? Compelling somebody to perform commercial sex acts using force, fraud, or coercion. Or if that person is under the age of 18 and performing commercial sex acts, they're automatically victims of sex trafficking. Force, fraud, or coercion doesn't need to be proven if they're under 18. Now, if they're over 18, that force, fraud, or coercion does need to be proven to show that it is sex trafficking specifically. However, again, I can't stress this enough. If somebody's under the age of 18, a child is under the age of 18 and performing commercial sex acts, force, fraud, or coercion doesn't need to be proven. They don't even need to have a trafficker involved to be considered a victim of sex trafficking. Under federal law and also under state law, due to the safe harbor legislation, children are not empowered to consensually make the decision to sell commercial sex. And we can go down the rabbit hole of, the spectrum of consent and all that around commercial sex, but I don't have time today. I'm sorry. You got to go to the 201. You got to sit into some of our other sessions this month as we give you every program we have. So anyway, so this is just an example of what domestic minor sex trafficking looks like. They're under the age of 18. They're sold or exploited for the purposes of sex, and they're a child of they are a citizen from the United States. So if they're from another country and being trafficked in here, being exploited for sex in the US, there are also remedies for them as well. That's called the T visa. I put in domestic minor sex trafficking victims for children born here, but if they're born in a different country and they're not citizens of the US, there are still remedies for them as well. They're still considered sex trafficking victims, and they still should get all the support that's available. So the average age of a person first being prostituted, I know the video said 12 years old. Again, numbers again, like we can't possibly know 100% with complete certainty that that's the age, right? 11 to 14 years old is what we typically go with at NC Stop Human Trafficking. We're factoring in familial trafficking, because the younger the child, the more likely it's familial trafficking, right? In this number, the average age could go up depending on the sample size of a study, right? So it's really going to be dependent on a lot of things. So we use this range specifically. So there is no such thing as a child prostitute, right? That would indicate that this child made the decision to sell commercial sex, and they can't, not in the state, not in the US. I mean, they just can't. So these are abused children and victims of sex trafficking. So when I say not in the country, there are some children who are being arrested across the US for selling commercial sex, and that's based on state laws too. So I just wanted to throw that out there. There's a lot of other states that don't have safe harbor laws like the safe harbor law like we do, or one as comprehensive as North Carolina has. So that's a good thing about North Carolina. So the vulnerable and the recruitment process. So what's happening here? Where does sex trafficking occur? Well, massage parlors, I did mention the illicit massage businesses that is a problem in North Carolina, but there are also brothels, not legal ones, of course. There are only 3 counties in Nevada where brothels are legal, but that doesn't mean they don't operate illegally here. Strip clubs, escort services, military bases, truck stops, migrant or seasonal worker camps, convention centers, sporting events, tourist destinations, modeling studios, spas, and the internet. The internet's going to play a huge role in human trafficking now, whether it be recruitment, whether it be grooming, recruitment, or advertising and selling for commercial sex, right? So who are the traffickers? Parents and family are oftentimes perpetrators of sex trafficking and labor trafficking, of children specifically. And this one's a hard one to talk about, but it happens a lot, right? 1 in 6 victims trafficked under the age of 12 were trafficked by a family member. One survivor said, "I could never escape. I never have anyone to turn to. I didn't have a choice. I was born to this." And that's kind of what familial trafficking does look like. When the caregiver is trafficking the children, the options are pretty limited for that child. So they disclose, and then they go into the system. And children love their caregivers. They love their parents, you know. So it's pretty tough. If they're 10 or younger, it's almost exclusively a family member who trafficked them. We're talking about victimization demographics right now. Pimps are often glorified in our popular culture. So who else are traffickers? Well, pimps. But we don't see them as we don't see them as doing heinous crimes like trafficking, right? We don't name it that. And that's because pop culture throughout history has really glorified it. We could go back to Taxi Driver. I might not have gotten that movie name correct, but you know what I'm talking about, where Harvey Keitel, I believe, is portrayed as a, not a bad guy, but he's trafficking a 12-year-old girl in that movie, and no one thinks about it when they're watching it. Go to Risky Business, and then you've got the Guido, who's making threats to Tom Cruise in this snapshot right here, but he's also portrayed as merciful and threatening all at once, but also like a comic relief, And then you got not that recently, but when I was younger, it was 50 Cent. He came out with a song called PIMP, and that reached number 2 on the Billboard charts. And those lyrics to that song are he's literally saying he's beating somebody to perform commercial sex acts so they will make him money, right? And we just don't see it. But anybody can be a trafficker, right? Anybody who's willing to make money off the exploitation and abuse of someone else is a trafficker. The traffickers don't know. You can't see a trafficker based on their gender, based on their race, or based on their ethnicity, right? It's anybody willing to exploit another person. So traffickers work in this kind of way, and it's not always this way, but they do typically find a vulnerable person, they groom them, and when I say groom, they convince the victim to believe that they are their best friend, their lover, their savior, they're going to get married, whatever the trafficker thinks that person needs in their life. And at that point, the trafficker has control, and then they'll sell them to other people for sex. And after that happens, typically the victim feels trapped with a mentality that this is the life that they chose. And they also develop a trauma bond with the trafficker, okay? Because in many cases, it is a romantic relationship, or there's a connection there between them. So this is from a book called 48 Laws of the Game, Pimpology by Pippa Ken. But you know what? And not only do traffickers read 48 Laws of the Game, but they also read The Art of Seduction and 48 Rules of Power. It's the same principle, right? How to maintain control over other people, right? And this is just one sentence from this book. And if you want to read it, it's free to read on Google. Wouldn't recommend it, but what he says is the main thing about putting a girl you just put out to work is breaking her down mentally and making sure she understands she no longer owns any part of her body or even a mind at this point. You own that body and she belongs to you. So some state and federal laws. I've already mentioned the Safe Harbor Law that passed in 2013, and I've already mentioned the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. In 2009, the North Carolina passed a human trafficking statute, its first, which just kind of established the North Carolina Human Trafficking Commission. In 2015, sex trafficking was included in sex ed classes. As a focus on preventative measures, this law is largely ineffective, because, unfunded mandates, right? In 2019, North Carolina expanded its functions for human trafficking survivors to seek relief for criminal record acquired during their victimization, which is super important when we're talking about restoration and recovery of victims. And then in I think it's 2019 as well, all school personnel are required to have 2 hours of sex trafficking education and child sexual abuse training, which is really great because we were asking teachers to teach about sex trafficking before they learned about sex trafficking. So that might be a little bit about why some of that sex ed wasn't as robust or as good as it could have been, right? So let's talk about some intersections of human trafficking. And we're not going to spend a long time on this. Substance abuse. Drugs are sometimes used as a form of manipulation and coercion by traffickers, right? Sometimes the trafficker is also a drug dealer. Drugs are also used as a way for a victim to cope with their trauma. So initially they weren't on using any kind of substance, but developed a substance use disorder to deal with the trauma of being trafficked. The opioid crisis has led to an overburdened foster care system in the state, leading to more vulnerable children. And I'm going to say this, forced selling of drugs is labor trafficking. It absolutely is. And when we talk about gang activity, or that's what we'll see it, right? It might not be it's an illicit labor, but labor nonetheless, right? Now I say that, but I can also say that they will probably be arrested for selling drugs, of course. That is a very good question that we have in the Q&A. Are state, county, or city employees taught? We would love that to happen, but not across the board. No, I don't think so. And they would be a good people to know and see like these indicators, right? But that's not a mandate that I'm familiar with on a state level. I mean, it would depend on the county and city municipalities at that point. This happened in Cumberland County. This is an example of a drug dealer who was also a trafficker. Robin Applewhite was sentenced to 230 years in prison in order to pay $608,000 in restitution to his victims after coercing them to sell commercial sex acts to support their heroin and prescription pill addiction. So what he did was he actually set up dates with women who were already kind of involved in the sex trade to support their substance use disorder. And what he did was he set up those dates, and then he said, hey, come work for me. I'll give you all the drugs you want. And they did. And it turned out to be very abusive. They weren't given any money, just drugs. Reports indicate that he locked some of these survivors in his basement and things like that. So another intersection is gang activity, right? In Eastern North Carolina, there is a prevalence of gang activity, largely due to the locations on the I-95 corridor, but there's gang activity across the state where there is substance use disorders, with likely gang activity for sure. Gangs often make money by trafficking girls and women for sex, and gangs also use a form of labor trafficking to facilitate illegal activity. Now, on the left, you'll see gang tags. That's what, when I was a journalist again, we did an enterprise piece on gang activity. And in the small city of Goldsboro, it's 254 active gang members. That's a very small city, right? And when we say gangs, most people assume we're just talking about street gangs, and that is not true. North Carolina has several types of gangs. So we've got the street gangs, of course, but then we also have outlaw motorcycle gangs that operate just like sell drugs and guns and are also trafficking people. And then we have hate groups that also operate as gangs because they're doing the same activity as well. They're also hate groups. So it's important to understand that when we talk about gangs, we're talking about the whole spectrum of them. And you can find all that information out on GangNet. I don't know if there's any updated information. The last gang information I was able to get from the GangNet report from the state was in 2013, if I'm not mistaken. So it's pretty old now. but it could have been updated since I checked last. So another intersection of human trafficking, pornography, right? As a matter of fact, that's the #1 industry in the United States for human trafficking, not sex trafficking. The venue where the sex trafficking is occurring is through pornography, because it's very lucrative. But pornography production and sex trafficking are not always separate, and it's important to understand that. Nearly 50% of sex trafficking victims report being involved in a pornography while being trafficked. Jewel Baraka, who was trafficked in pornography while between the ages of 14 and 17, said the brutality of those 3 years of being trafficked in porn nearly killed me. Again, while some victims agree to the initial production, they are then coerced and forced in participating in sexual acts they did not agree to. That is sexual assault. That's sexual assault for profit, and that's sex trafficking, right? It's really just important to not sanitize language around what we're talking about, okay? Pornography typically isn't a well-regulated industry. If you can just upload any kind of video online and make money off of it, then that's what traffickers are going to do. They're going to they want the multiple streams of income, right? So there could be uploading pornographies. They could be having an OnlyFans, making the money off of the people who are on the who are the content creator for the OnlyFans. I mean, we really just have to kind of understand the nature of exploitation and how there's going to be multiple forms. There are multiple ways a trafficker can exploit somebody, and understanding that and recognizing it on different platforms is really important, right? So we can't really talk about the intersection of pornography without talking about child sexual abuse material or child sexual abuse images, right? It's known as child porn typically, but we don't use that language. It's child sexual abuse material. That's what it is. And it's also human trafficking. The most popular sexual searches include the word young. So what we're looking at is demand for it. So when you type in that in the search bar, right, what's going to pop up, right? Child sexual abuse material. Traffickers are going to upload whatever they believe is going to make them money. So that's why it's there. The internet's really saturated with child sexual abuse material. And no, not a lot of regulation around it, right? So 54% of daily porn users believe that pornography involving teenagers is wrong. So there's 46% of daily porn users believing that it is okay. And so when we see attitudes around that and like how we are culturally set up to accept exploitation, because we kind of are until we, point it out and say, this isn't correct, and shift the culture, this is what's going to happen, right? If you have any questions about that, please ask me. I'm more than happy to answer any questions you may have. This happened in Craven County. This is an example of the demand side of child sexual abuse material, right? Havelock City Commissioner Pete Van Vliet, his last name is actually spelled V-L-I-E-T, my mistake, was arrested on 12 counts of second-degree sexual exploitation of a minor by the FBI. And according to those arrest warrants, the FBI says they found computer files of children, some possibly as young as 2 years old, engaging in various sex acts with other children as well as adults. He pled guilty in August of 2020. And he pleaded guilty in August of 2020, excuse me. And now he is a registered sex offender, but he only got 5 years of probation on a suspended sentence, right? So when we say it's a low-cost crime, we really mean it. That's what we're doing advocacy-wise around legislation and things like that too. Just trying to make sure justice is there, right? I hope this is making sense. If it's not, please ask some questions. So if you want to learn more about how child sexual abuse material affects people long range, those kids on a longer term scale, you can always watch the Not Just Pictures documentary. It's really good. So anyway, now we're going to get into the reporting of the red flags and warning signs, because I only got about 20 minutes left and I want to respect your time. Populations more vulnerable to being trafficked. Now I mentioned them earlier, And when I say population's vulnerable, I want to make sure everybody understands I don't believe that these people are weak or less than in any way. It means they lack social supports, right? They just fall through the cracks, and that's not their fault. It's actually our fault, society's fault, right? When you don't have a lot of choices, what's left? Anyway, some vulnerable populations include people who struggle with substance use disorder, people who have a mental illness, people who have a learning disability, people who have a developmental delay, people who have lived through childhood sexual abuse, people who have a history, their family has a history of sexual exploitation by their family members. So what I'm saying is their dad may have been a trafficker, or their mother may have been a prostituted person, right? They lack social support. So that covers the whole gamut, right, of any kind of population that kind of lacks the social support necessary. And the LGBTQIA plus community is also more vulnerable to being trafficked. And that is because they lack the social supports, not only societal supports, but a lot of times family support. So they don't really have anyone to help them on the way, right? Because we are all, if we're all being honest, we all need connection. So with that, these are some suspicious homes or business activity and characteristics, right? So if you see a business that seems suspicious. Unusual security measures, right? Like there are cameras around a home that looks like a dump, right? Does that make sense? Or barbed wire facing toward a building. So that keeps people in. You see young women go in, but rarely leave. And if they do leave, they always are accompanied by someone. Lots of coming and going, mostly male. I know we talk about men a lot when we're talking about sex buying. And let me just explain, 98 to 99% of sex buyers, and this is just the information that we have available, just so we're all on the same page about that. But 98 to 99% of sex buyers are men. Okay. Which means there's a small percentage that are women. Lots of coming and going, mostly male again. Employees live where they work, and employees arrive and leave in the same vehicle. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with carpooling, just so we're on the same page about that, but you want to put together all the dots, right? This is just a photo of a Miami Beach massage parlor that was raided by police in 2017. So this is what we mean when we say the employees live where they work. Questions to ask yourself if you're trying to identify a possible victim, right? Does the possible victim have identification? And if they don't, who does? Do they have very few personal possessions? Are they not in control of their own money? Is there a communication problem or language barrier? Now, just if there's a language barrier, that does not mean they're being trafficked. You want to add all the little pieces together, right? I don't want to go over that with you. That's communication techniques, but I'm going to discourage you from, as a general community member, I'm going to discourage you from trying to communicate if you see something suspicious, because it may be dangerous for you. Now, if you are a professional in the room and you are interested in learning about communication techniques, please shoot me an email. My email is going to be at the end of this presentation, okay? And I'll talk to you more about how, I'll talk to you more about what we can do in a professional setting with people who have the know-how to respond to situations that could possibly be dangerous, or, especially if you're like law enforcement or you're a counselor or something. Anyway, just email me if you want more information about that. I just don't want general community members to hurt themselves. So there's other questions to ask yourself. Does the potential victim chronically run away from home? Is the potential victim homeless? Does the potential victim live with a romantic partner or a boss? Does the potential victim act fearful, anxious, depressed, submissive, tense, or nervous and paranoid? Now, if anybody is acting this way, there's nothing wrong with asking them if they're okay, right? And this doesn't have to be a human trafficking situation either. If you see someone out who's acting fearful, anxious, depressed, submissive, tense, or overly nervous and paranoid, asking them if they're okay, that's okay. That's probably what you should do, honestly. Is the potential victim engaging in uncharacteristically promiscuous behavior, making references to sexual situations or terminology that are beyond their age-specific norms? So that can be a telltale sign of child sexual abuse as well. Does the potential victim appear to be restricted from contacting family, friends, or their legal guardian? That's when the trafficker is really going to try to isolate somebody. So when you see someone being isolated and you have all these other red flags, that's definitely a strong indicator, right? And if you believe that somebody that you know personally, this may be happening to them, and you're able to talk with them, absolutely. If you're able to talk with them privately anyway, and it's somebody you personally know, it's not some stranger, just ask like if everything is okay, and know that you can always call the human trafficking hotline if it's somebody that you're very familiar with. I hope that makes sense. And I'll give you the human trafficking hotline number at the end of this presentation. This is an example of labor trafficking that happened in Wilmington. This happened in 2014. And teenagers ran away from their North Dakota home to sell magazines. So, does the potential victim seem to lack control over their schedule, money, and identification, right? So this is a person you know, right? And all of a sudden they can't tell you when they can go to the doctor, or they can't give you any identification if you're trying to hire someone and they don't have any identification to speak of, or they can't tell you when they can work and things like that. They have to ask someone else. Do they have tattoos or other marks that would indicate? Now these tattoos can be different, so just know if you see like one tattoo. There was some instances in literature that I was reading where they came into a healthcare setting and they all 3 women all had the same exact tattoo, right? So and it's all of the initials of a guy. So that's a good indicator. They're affiliated with a gang or dating a gang member. There appears to be abuse of substances. There are signs of trauma, whether it be physical or otherwise, and there is a vague story of how those injuries occurred, right? And this is, does the potential victim suddenly have a more expensive material possessions? This is in the grooming phase, right? Traffickers will, groom and recruit victims, and in the beginning phases, they're going to, give them expensive things and nice things. This happens a lot when we're talking about kids who are getting groomed, right? They make reference. Does the person make references to frequent travel to other cities? And they won't say, well, I went on vacation. It's like, well, I went to, Atlanta. Then I went to for a day, and then I went to Miami for 2 days, and then I went up to, New York. That kind of travel. It's odd. And do they have a lot of hotel key cards? Of course. Does the possible victim have a much older romantic partner? This happened in Wilson County when we're talking about a much older romantic partner. This child was 13 years old. 2 years later, he befriended her, and 2 years later, he's charged with forcing her to perform commercial sex acts at migrant labor camps. So he was sentenced to 40 years, but there were also 4 other people who were convicted in this case. So this one child had 5 traffickers, excuse me. So that doesn't typically happen, but and this is the survivor. And this survivor in this video, she's just saying that she could not have gotten out without help. So that's why I'm really glad you're here. I'm really happy that you're learning about what human trafficking is and how to safely report it, right? So this is what she has to say.
There's no way I could have left. I tried. I think I tried 2 different occasions. The first time, we were too scared. And the second time, he had our papers, our passports, and just scared because unknowing that there was help out there for us. It's just the fear of me losing my kids, and my kids were scared of losing their mother, because that's all that we knew. If you don't do this, the authorities are going to come and take you, or that he will kill us. So there's no way that we could have left. No way. That we thought that nobody would believe us. So without help, there's no way we could have left. No way.
Okay, so I'm trying to come back. There we go. So just so everybody, this has been a pretty heavy presentation, a pretty heavy chat, a pretty heavy talk about human trafficking. I want you to know that she's doing okay. She's going to school, and was able to get out, and she's doing well. So I'm very happy that you're here today as community members, right? Because there's something that you can do. Now, I'm not going to encourage you to interfere with any trafficking situation that you may be seeing, but I am going to encourage you to call the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-888-373-7888. You can call that number at 1-888-373-7888. You can text Be Free to 233-733, or you can text if you need more information to the hotline, you can text info to 233-733. But if you need help, you can text help to 233-733, and they respond. They are professionals at the response in human trafficking situations, right? You can live chat humantraffickinghotline.org. I tell you all this about the National Human Trafficking Hotline because North Carolina doesn't have a hotline, right? And there isn't a response is different in different areas, is what I'm saying, in the state. But if you call the hotline, they call professionals who respond to human trafficking victims in the area that the victim is calling from, or the person reporting is calling from, right? And the case is investigated like a human trafficking case, because sometimes if you contact law enforcement, that law enforcement body or that law enforcement agency may not have had the training in what human trafficking is. Does that make sense? Not all of them, but some of them don't have. Don't have the training. Now, BLET classes now have about 2 hours of human trafficking training within their course. So new officers coming in know, for the most part. Not a lot, but they know the nature of human trafficking in a nutshell. But officers who've been officers who have been excuse the redundancy, officers for a long time may not have had the training yet, right? Because this is a relatively new not new crime, but it's the awareness part is pretty new in the state. So if you believe that it's a child abuse situation, however, by state law in North Carolina, now I know we have other people tuning in from across the state, though, across the country, but by state law in North Carolina, you are required to call law enforcement and child protective services in your area and report it, okay? But I would also encourage you every time to call the National Human Trafficking Hotline as well. That way we'll have the number. We'll have data, right? Does anybody have any questions about how to report? Because this is very important. So I'm glad you're here, because I want you to know how to safely report your suspicions. Okay, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. I'll be happy to answer them. A little bit about us. NC Stop Human Trafficking is a membership organization. So you can join as a member, an agency or nonprofit, or a business. You can follow us on social media at NC Stop Human Trafficking on Facebook and Instagram, but also our Twitter and our YouTube. Our training sessions are always uploaded to YouTube. And we have a strong we work in a strong collaborative way. and one of our strongest coalitions is the Pitt County Coalition Against Human Trafficking. We actually meet every third Thursday at 9:30 a.m., but it's on Evans Street in Greenville. If you're interested in developing a coalition in your community, I definitely encourage you to get up with me. You have my email. You can also start the conversation with the people that you know in your circle of influence and let them know what human trafficking really is. Buy Fair Trade, again, our Fair Traders Project is, you can follow at Fair Traders Project on Instagram or Facebook, and you can visit the website at www.fairtradersproject.org. That's our website, our shop. You can look for these logos in your grocery store if you want to buy ethically sourced products. And this is me, Melinda Sampson, the Community Outreach Coordinator for NC Stop Human Trafficking. And this is Pam. I do want you to ask any questions that you may have. I am going to stop sharing the screen so I can put in the post survey. I do want to give you time to do that. If I can find it. Give me one sec. Oh, there it is. And I'm going to be leaving this open for questions. Whenever you want to ask one, please put it in the Q&A box. I would definitely appreciate any kind of questions. I love doing human trafficking 101 sessions, and the community questions are always really great. So I'm putting the post survey in the chat box. Please, if you guys could fill that out for me, that would be really wonderful. Oh, thank you, Angela. Angela, who was once an intern here, she did great work, asked how much money did I raise wearing dresses this December. I wear a dress every day to raise money for local anti-human trafficking programs. And outpaced myself, raising more than the $1,000 goal I had to $1,725. It was a good month for me. Thank you for the question, Angela.